Okay, thanks very much. The goal of Corbis is to build the entire human experience throughout history in pictures. And actually, Li Lu and I were looking today into the Corbis library, and we were looking at 100 or so pictures of the uprising in Tiananmen Square. We're going to show you two views of that tonight. One is through a CD-ROM title called Leonardo da Vinci, the other through the Turnley brothers that I think you'll enjoy greatly. I also did a search last night and found a picture of Richard in the Corbis library. I was going to show it to you tonight, but I won't for purposes of time, maybe later. I'd like to tell you very quick, there was a joke recently in a Silicon Valley magazine about the devil and Moses. I don't know if you saw it. They're at a table, the tablets are in the middle of the table, and the devil says to Moses, "You keep the tablets, all I want are the digital rights." That's not Corbis, but I would like to introduce and have Curtis Wong show you Leonardo. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Well, I feel like I'm caught between a mountain and a hard place. This is really a tough place to talk, but thanks for bearing with me. This title, Leonardo da Vinci, has a history that goes back 17 years. 17 years ago, Armand Hammer bought a document called the Codex Leicester. And for 200 years, it had been in that country, and I had the opportunity to see it. It was on display for 3 weeks. And I saw it at the LA County Museum of Art, and I was really amazed by it. I mean, it's a document about water and the earth and astronomy, and I remember when I saw it, it was such an amazing document. I don't know if you know that Codex Leicester is written in 14th century Renaissance Italian backwards. And I was just amazed by it, but what struck me about it was that, as my Greek teacher used to say, it's all Japanese to me. I mean, I didn't understand anything about it. And fast forward 15 years later, I'm working for Corbis, and Bill Gates buys the Codex. I thought, great, this is the opportunity to create the CD-ROM that I wanted to have when I saw the Codex, because I could really then begin to understand it. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of that CD-ROM. Can you bring the lights down, please? There are a couple things that we try and think about when we're doing CD-ROMs. And the two things that are really important to us, one is context and two is story. I don't know if you've been in a position when you're looking at something and you don't even know enough to ask a question. And what we try and do with our CDs is set that stage, build that context by drawing people in. You saw that opening there. And through context, what we try and do here is build context by leading people through the process. It's a welcome that explains what this CD-ROM is all about. There's a guide that takes you through how to use it. And the next step might be a little guided tour about the Renaissance. Our main menu here is in the form of a tree, and it's done in the style of a painting that perhaps Leonardo, we hope, would do something like that. And Leonardo often used the tree as a metaphor for the growth and branching of ideas. And so at the roots of this tree are the Renaissance, and there are a number of short guided tours, anywhere from about 7 to 10 minutes, that explain about the Renaissance. And then when you go to the trunk of the tree, it begins with some background on the life of Leonardo, his thinking, and then a discussion about the Codex itself, which is a discussion about nature. And as I said earlier, the Codex is about 3 major themes. And so the tree then branches into a tour about the body of the earth, the water, and the heavens. Now, one of the challenges in building and designing for interactive is you want to have a story that develops and progresses because you want to try to bring somebody from point A to point B. But the problem with that is you also need to allow people to interact, to explore those kinds of things that are brought up in the tour. And so the reason, what we've done here is we've segregated the interactive components with the narrative components by providing these exhibits. Now, in exhibits, they follow the tour. So here you can explore things that relate to the sun and the earth. Here, exhibits related to the water, and that with the earth. At the very top of the tree, if you'll look in the leaves, and also here, are two things. One is a gallery where we've included all of Leonardo's paintings and about 80 of sketches and letters and other things like that. And lastly, there's the Codex Leicester itself. I'm going to play you a little bit of what I'm talking about of the guided tour so you can get a sense of what I mean by tour.
In an age that was ripe with talent, no one achieved preeminence in more areas than Leonardo. Nature so favored him, wrote the historian Vasari, that no one else was ever equal to him in the perfection, liveliness, vitality, excellence, and grace of his works. At a loss to explain Leonardo's diversity, by turns artist and scientist, mathematician, inventor, and engineer, Vasari invoked divine inspiration. What drove Leonardo to seek excellence in so many different spheres? The answer is simple, if awesome in its implications.
I'm going to stop it here. You notice there's a progress gauge on the bottom. We're always thinking about the user in terms of when you're in something like this that is going by itself, how far along am I in this? How do I get out of this if I want to stop it? And you can also move ahead and click and see a different section of it. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a little tree, and you also see a little block here. And this tells you symbolically of that tree that you saw earlier, what section you're in. You can also go directly to any other section just by mousing over. Let me go to a section on an exhibit about water. What we did is we took some of Leonardo's drawings about water experiments and we reproduced those in a hydrology lab. And there are many ways to get in here and explore some individual things. This is a drawing that Leonardo did about this house here where the river was undercutting it. And he explained his solution, which was to build a succession of dams which would reroute the river and redeposit material underneath the house. I'll show you just one more exhibit here. This one is on the sun and the earth. And this is about the motion of the moon around the earth. And we animated his drawings here so you could get a look at that as well. There are many, many of these in here. Let me go to the gallery. As I said earlier, we have over 100 works by Leonardo. This happens to be a gallery that was designed by Leonardo but was actually never built, and we've recreated it here in 3D. Here in this room in front of us, there are paintings, drawings, documents, a number of things. Let's go into the painting room. Here are all of Leonardo's known paintings shown in scale, so you get a sense of their size, and of course you can mouse over any of these. This particular painting is in the National Gallery of Art. Double-clicked. And you can move the mouse over any portion of it and take a look. The painting also has a back as well. You can look at that. In the room next door, there are documents. This happens to actually be Leonardo's birth certificate. So you can actually see it says Nomo Leonardo here. And if you want to see it in English, you can see that as well. What I said about context earlier, the other thing that we try and do is give people a sense of time context. Here we've listed a number of events in history, Leonardo's life, the arts, and discovery to give you a sense of context of other events that are going on at that time. And there are many, many here, as you can see just by scrolling a little bit. And there's depth in each one of these particular elements. And here's a sketch he made at a young age in Arno Valley. But getting directly to it, this is the Codex Leicester right here. And this is what I wanted back in 1980. Here are all the pages of the Codex listed, and on the right there are a number of themes, and if you mouse over any of these themes, it shows you what themes are on those pages. If you just click, it holds that. Now, my particular interest has always been astronomy. And so this is the first page of the Codex, and you're looking at it, and there are overviews and a number of other things that give you background about
Leonardo always
each page.
insisted on observation, that you had to look, and for Leonardo, looking was always analysis. he never looked at anything without saying, how is this working? Why does it look like it does?
I'm going to stop that here. Okay. You can also always go anywhere else directly, but let's cut to the chase and get to the document. This is what I saw, and I'm sure you'll agree with me. It's pretty unintelligible because certainly it's backwards. Now, we have the advantage now of being able to flip from left to right, and that certainly helps a bit, but I don't know how many of you here can read Old Renaissance Italian. So the group of us that got together on the Leonardo team figured out a device that we now call the codoscope. It's that thing you always wanted when you took a foreign language. And I'll show you here. And here, what we do is we translate on the fly in English. Now, one thing about Leonardo, in his day, there were very few people that were his intellectual equal. And so he would have these philosophical arguments with himself. And so you're reading this, he says, remember how I first have to demonstrate the distance of the sun to the earth. He is talking to you. And this particular aspect of this was what was overwhelming to me, this sense of being able to really get to the essence of Leonardo. Another feature we have here is the ability to see a direct transcription. So if you can't read his handwriting, you can begin to see le avversare oppone and make out the Italian writing. You can also flip this into English, so if you want to learn Italian English, you can do that as well. But I know we're short on time, so I'm just going to kind of set this down and put it away. I just want to say one other thing before I close. It's that the last thing I think that I tell our teams that when we're doing this, and it relates to the discussion earlier, is that when we're doing these titles on CD-ROM, one of the most important things is make sure what you're doing is better than can be done on this medium than any other medium. Don't put a book on a CD-ROM. And I think as long as we aspire to do something like this, that books will continue to be here because I love my books and I never give them up. But we're creating something here that has value and it really demonstrates what the potential, I think, of this medium. Thank you.
I hope you can see the passion that we have with pictures at Corbis and how pictures can be used to inform, to educate, and to create emotion. Our current projects include an online site, which we did with PBS on Jefferson, that's about 4 or 5 days old, and it's truly extraordinary. I hope you'll take a look at it either at PBS or at Corbis. Our next CD-ROM title is on the art and life of Ansel Adams, and hope that we can show that to you. I think that'll be quite wonderful as well. In 1996, Corbis brought the photographic collection of David and Peter Turnley into the Corbis Library. David and Peter are two of the top photojournalists in the world. They've won every prize of photography, including the Pulitzer. They have a very special connection, which he talked about, to Li Lu, and they will as well. And I would like them to really expand upon that. We're very pleased to be associated with these two outstanding photographers and their art. And let me introduce them.
Am I live? Okay. Well, so to speak, right? A year ago, we looked at some of Corbis's things here. We shoehorned them in the end. It was clearly an extraordinary piece of work. And this work of Leonardo just brings the understanding of information to still another level. And as you know, that is my singular passion. And I'm just in awe of what they've done and what Curtis has done and what Doug supports to have happen. It is really the best of that whole genre, and I know we didn't give it enough time, and I just want to say it's wonderful things. You should really take a look at it. Okay, gentlemen.
Thank you. I'm David Turnley, and I'll start. I flew here from Cape Town, South Africa 2 days ago. I was down in that country doing a story on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Just before I left, I spent the morning with a dear friend and a hero of mine, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and we spoke about a number of things. One of the things that I commented on was my sense and my having been impressed for so long at the ability of black South Africans to forgive. He responded to my comments by saying that in his African language there's a word, Rowoturn, which refers to the idea that one is only human in connection to other people. To undermine someone else is to undermine one's own humanity. And that resonated in my mind on so many levels, and certainly in terms of my engagement with photography. The camera has been for me a means to walk into communities that I wanted to know, represented the possibility to be creative, and given me a voice with which I can shout as much about the glory of the world that I've witnessed as the injustice. Peter and I would like to show you a retrospective of our work, and I will go first. You can start these slides now.
Bring the light down a little bit.
And then you can just turn the light on us down. When we were 17, Peter and I embarked on a 2-year project. Can we focus that a little bit, please? Thank you. Embarked on a 2-year documentary photographing an inner city neighborhood in Fort Wayne, Indiana, where we grew up. It was to begin a style that has stayed with me in my subsequent efforts, an approach to photography that requires patience to access intimate moments of people's everyday life. This is a project that I began in 1978, photographing for 2 years an elderly farm couple on a rural farm in Michigan, Anna and Flander. They'd been married 50 years and did subsistence farming. I was taken by their approach to life that had such a harmony between the work that they did to raise their crops and the food that they then put on the table to subsist. This was a photograph taken in Appalachia. In 1980, I began a documentary of a dramatic process in Detroit in which an entire community was destroyed, 6,000 people displaced to build a Cadillac General Motors factory. In 82, I went to the Middle East to do what was at that time the first photographic essay published in an American mainstream publication about the Palestinian diaspora. Indira Gandhi's funeral in 1984. In 1985, I went to South Africa. I was driven to photograph not only the confrontation, but the day-to-day psychological nuances that existed under the system of apartheid that destroyed people's lives, perhaps more importantly than the actual confrontation itself. I spent 3 years there before ultimately I was kicked out of the country by the Botha regime, the 11th journalist that year to be expelled from South Africa. It was, in effect, a compliment to my work. The Botha regime expelled people whose work they perceived to have an impact in conscientizing people to the dynamics of apartheid. I've continued to document the evolution of that country since. This was Winnie Mandela in 1986. I lived with her for a year for a month doing an essay for Life magazine. These were the first non-white elections in 1994. Nelson Mandela during his campaign. I was in Cape Town the day he was released from prison, and then accompanied him as his photographer around the world on his first trip after his release. This was Mrs. Botha listening to his inauguration speech. The earthquake in Armenia in 1987, which resulted in 40,000 people losing their life. Belfast, Northern Ireland. Can we focus that projector, please? Thank you. The Berlin Wall in 1989. This began, as you know, a month-by-month process in which the countries in Eastern Europe changed from Berlin to Czechoslovakia, Romania, Poland, Hungary. Bucharest, Romania, the first day of the revolution. The revolution in Romania was really one of the most sinister sets of dynamics that I've witnessed, the catharsis of emotion from the legacy of what was clearly one of the most repressive regimes in European history. Tiananmen Square in 1989. I was one of 2 or 3 photographers who were in the streets the entire night of the massacre. Baghdad just before the war. The Gulf War was, for me, a horrific experience. The American Pentagon had figured out after Vietnam that photographic images change public opinion. And during the wars in Grenada and Panama, they had managed to perfect their marketing arm to create the impression that the Gulf War was about technology and not human life. This, as I worked my tail off to be in a position to make the previous photograph, which was one of the only documents of that war that left a testimony to the fact that people do die. I spent 3 months just before the first coup d'etat in the ex-Soviet Union doing a trip around 22 cities in 11 republics, making a photographic diary of that country. It so happened the last week of my trip, the first coup happened in Moscow, changing the status quo in the ex-Soviet Union. Rwanda, 1994. Somalia. I ask myself sometimes whether my work has contributed to make a difference I think sometimes it has. I think that the photographic images collectively that colleagues and myself had made during the famines in Rwanda and Somalia helped to mobilize some attention to that situation. I think the photograph I made during the Gulf War went a long way to defy the press restrictions that I spoke about. I think the fact that the South African government kicked me out of their country was a testimony to their perception that somehow my work was having an effect. This was an essay I spent a year doing around the world on the issue of immigration. Haiti in 1992, just before the American intervention. Chechnya in 1994, far and away the most dangerous conflict that I've covered. To be in Grozny during that time, February 1994, was to experience effectively Russian roulette. The Russian army was raining shells over that city 24 hours a day. I've tried to preempt what I saw as the inevitable political conflicts in various places around the world. This is a story that I went to do in Hebron in 1995 before it became before it received the international attention that we've come to know it as. My interest was much like my work in South Africa, to photograph the day-to-day life of this city that was so peculiarly divided with what unfortunately is so often the case, barriers that divide people that have so much in common. Bosnia, 1995. I spent a year photographing refugees throughout the ex-Yugoslavia. This was a wedding on the front line in Sarajevo a week before the peace accords. Bushmen in Botswana, in the central Kalahari. This was one of the most interesting stories I've ever worked on. In closing my portion of these photographs, I'd just like to say that I would really like to solicit your visions and your access to the technology that you have that you're about, and to underscore that with this technology we be sensitive to a world with spirit and with soul, and to always think about those who have less.
I'm pleased to be able to share my work with a group of people with your collective power and mastery of technology. I first began to make pictures when I was 17 years old. I was brought up in the heartland of American Indiana, and at the time I first touched the camera, our country was in full change amidst much turmoil. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War. Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated. School busing for desegregation had begun, and the U.S. was in the middle of a sexual revolution and experiencing wide generation gaps. I developed an obsessive passion for photography immediately. It became my tool for expressing myself in ways that 25 years later I continue to try to do. I've been strongly motivated to share with others through photography the qualities of people in the world that are beautiful and glorious. I've often witnessed incredible demonstrations of human dignity, grace, honesty, tolerance, and love. I also have tried to use the camera as a way of shouting, a means to shake people out of their armchairs to think about what is wrong, to think about racism, oppression, exclusion, ignorance, vulgarity, hatred, and intolerance. I have always fully defended the right to have a point of view. It is my power and I embrace it. In 1975, I was asked by the Office of Economic Opportunity of California to come to California and to do a documentary on poverty in this state. I spent 5 months traveling up and down the state of California. I was given enough money to pay for flea bag hotels and pay for my gasoline. And my pictures were used by the Office of Economic Opportunity to illustrate why impoverished areas needed social welfare programs. I've been very motivated by previous groups of work such as the FSA, Farm Security Administration photographs, and the way that they can indicate to people a need for attention to problems that can be righted. I first began to travel around the world in 1984. My first story abroad was Indira Gandhi's funeral and the subsequent Hindu-Sikh violence that followed. Since that time, I have traveled to 75 different countries, and I think I've covered most of the major geopolitical evolutions and events of the last decade. I've been a contract photographer for Newsweek magazine for the last 11 years. During that time, I've been able to spend long periods of time covering cycles of events. I've photographed the Palestinian-Israeli conflict since 1987. I spent 10 years photographing life in the Soviet Union and Russia. I first began to go to the Soviet Union in 1986. I'm probably the only Western photographer since that time to hold continuously a multiple entry visa and a press accreditation in Moscow. This has enabled me to cover the entire regime of Gorbachev. I've followed Gorbachev on every foreign trip he made abroad during his regime, and I was able to photograph continuously the process of glasnost and perestroika right through the coup in 1991. I was in Tiananmen Square in 1989. I happened to arrive in China the night that Li Lu mentioned, when 50 students first took a wreath to People's Square, Tiananmen Square, in memory of Hu Yaobang, who was the pro-democratic leader who sparked the beginning of the Tiananmen Square events. In 1989, I covered all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe. With my brother, we collaborated on 2 books, a book called Moments of Revolution, which was about all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, and a book called Beijing Spring, which chronicled all of the events of Tiananmen Square. I'd like to talk a little bit later about the incredible experience that I had last night actually being able to speak to Li Lu, because as he mentioned, he was a god to several million students at that time. I was a photographer witnessing this. He wouldn't have known who I was. I knew very well who he was. And for the 2 months of the Tiananmen Square situation, daily I witnessed the most incredible, uplifting vision of a spirit of youth with their innocent desire for freedom and democracy. Subsequent to the massacre, where I witnessed what military hardware can do to set back such a joyous process, I also was set back personally for a long time. I've been very interested in the plight of refugees around the world. Since 1988, I photographed most every major refugee population in the world. I think refugees are truly the world's true homeless. There are over 20 million refugees in the world. And I've been inspired to try to draw the world's attention to their plight. Many times in my work, I've been so struck by the incredible courage and decency and hope and elegance and goodness of people in the midst of difficult situations. People often ask me, well, don't you become cynical? Aren't you hardened? And on the contrary, my life has been immensely enriched by the spirit and the courage of people that I have photographed. I've always been more interested in general in my work with people that have too little as opposed to those that have too much. It happens, my brother and I have worked for different publications, but often by virtue of the magnitude of the news, we have been in the same places. Being a twin, this can occasionally create some very unusual situations, sometimes a bit humorous. I recall in the beginning of the Intifada in Israel, I had been in Israel for 2 months, and on a daily basis, just doing my job, I was often working in what was called closed military areas, and I would be daily ejected from these areas, arrested, and after 2 months I had incurred the wrath of several Israeli military officers, and just at the time that I was leaving Israel, my brother was arriving. And I called him on the phone and I said, David, you may encounter some hostility that you won't understand, but you should be aware of it. About a week later, I get a phone call from my brother, and he says, damn it, Peter, I was in this closed military area today, and I didn't even know where I was, and I get arrested, and I'm taken to a military command post, and the officer is so angry, he almost wants to hit me. And I said, but officer, you don't understand. I'm new here, and I don't know the rules. The man said, what do you mean? I've been kicking your ass out of here for the last 2 months. My brother said, you don't understand, that was my twin brother. The military officer crosses his arms and says, now that's original. During Tiananmen Square, at the evening that the statue of the Goddess of Liberty was brought into the square, it was early evening, the sun was going down, and to make a proper photograph of this situation, there was really only one place to be, and there were over 1 million students on the square, and as it happened, my brother and I were on 2 ladders right next to each other. And at one point, I noticed that there was this sort of rippling effect of faces that were turning to look towards us, and it actually was quite intimidating because of the immensity of the crowd. And I realized that they were looking at my brother and I. I turned to my brother and I said, Dave, I guess they really do think we all do look alike. In my own modest way, I have a sense that with photography and with communication, we really can touch our world and we can change things. I think I've seen this on a few occasions. In Somalia in 1992, and when the Kurds came across the mountains in northern Iraq at the end of the Gulf War, in both occasions, there were literally hundreds of thousands of people dying either of famine or of cold, without food. And when our photographs were on the cover of magazines and with the work of our colleagues and with television images, I'm convinced that it had a lot to do with why there were immediate military airlifts of food to these places, and I think maybe we did make a small contribution. I've been very interested in photographing the effects of landmines around the world. This last year, I was in Kabul, and during the month that I was there were over 80 amputations from landmines. And I'm interested in trying to visually communicate to people the necessity to gather a world consensus to ban anti-personnel landmines. I've been living in Paris for the last 20 years. I live in Paris for many reasons. I love Paris. I've embraced the city and the culture where I live, and I've been photographing extensively life in Paris for the last 20 years. I feel very strongly that photography is not a compartmentalization of my life. It's something that I live with in all aspects of my life. And I've had a delight photographing, as opposed to very difficult, hard moments, the more sensual, graceful, humoristic, and human life that I encounter in my life in France. I'm extremely excited and hopeful about our partnership with Corbis and its ability to use new technologies to touch more people than ever before with our pictures. It would be my dream that one day soon an elementary school child in China will see my photographs of Tiananmen Square. I believe that interactive uses of photography could open up doors of communication that will be today's Life magazine of the past. And I'd like to, as my brother said earlier, I would like to ask you to help us and our colleagues in whatever way possible with your mastery of these technologies and your power to help us communicate to people and to help us collectively use the power that we have to affect our world. Thank you very much. Lilu? I just would like to do, real quick, I'd like Lilu to come up for a second. It might enthuse you to know that as a result of this conference, maybe a very beautiful consequence will have happened. We spent last night, for the first time since Tiananmen Square, sharing memories of that time together, and it was amazing for us. As Liu said, when he left China, he didn't speak a word of English, and I couldn't communicate with him that time. And it was so beautiful. It was one of the most beautiful moments of my career to be able to talk with him last night and to share our thoughts. And we've decided that together, the three of us are going to use interactive technology to share our experiences and our images and our thoughts so that people in China today will know what happened during that time.
Quick, and then
Well, I just want to make a quick comment. I mean, the first encounter of us using technology was in 1989 when we began to use this thing called a fax. Now, through fax, we're able to simultaneously communicate what we want to do in Beijing demonstration simultaneously to about 150 different cities. And that's the only way we can communicate with others. And before that, I don't really know what fax is all about. Now, after the massacre, that was the only way we can communicate with people in different cities. And now, with this new thing called internet, now, I just gave many interviews just in the past few days. I've written an op-ed on the Wall Street Journal, which appeared today, which I put some copies there. Now, just imagine if we have a web with Peter and David's photograph and my comment, and not only everybody in the country, especially young people, will be able to learn live about Tiananmen Square, but everybody in China will be able to communicate and access to this, and think about how much power we have. And I believe that dictatorship can only rule by two means: ruthlessly crack down and skillful propaganda to erase history. If we're able to make them impossible to erase history, if we make it possible and cheap for people to communicate with each other, and that's, I think, when democracy would occur. I think that's what really the essence of this technological revolution is, in essence, a social revolution. And I just want to, all of us, to make sure we got to make the best use of this new technology, and it is our responsibility to do so.